Nick Freeman is a lawyer, also sometimes known as Mr. Loophole for his success in dealing with traffic and speeding offences. Welcome to the programme. What did you make of that offer of a review at the news conference last night?
I think Matt Hancock was caught on the back foot. I don't think he'd had time to actually reflect on what he said, but he did have the foresight to say, I will talk to my Treasury colleagues. And obviously that was a very quick conversation, and that's why it was never going to go anywhere. Each case stands or falls on its own merits, and there have been in excess of 14,000 people, I think, over the last few weeks who have paid fixed penalties under these 2020 regulations. They have been spoken to by the police. The police have exercised their discretion and decided to pursue these cases. And in each case where a payment's been made, the recipient has accepted their own culpability. They've found that, yes, they didn't have a reasonable excuse for leaving home. We don't know how many of those actually related to childcare, but I imagine a very small number. And those cases are really an irrelevance so far as what happened on the news. If the government wanted to say, look, in view of the embarrassing situation regarding Dominic Cummings, we are going to review and reconsider every case because we feel there's a degree of hypocrisy here, etc., that would be different. But what he said was, look, I'm going to consider it. I'm going to speak to my Treasury colleagues. There's no legal foundation for that conversation at all. Every case is separate and it depends on its own merits. The question really is whether or not Dominic Cummings has broken the law, and that's obviously a separate issue.
Well, I want to ask you about that, but just on the topic of people who may have paid a fixed penalty fine, travelling for family reasons, do they have any loophole now?
In my view, no, they don't. They'll have probably paid either £60 or £100 or half that if they're paid within a period of time. To pursue an action at the administrative court, which is what is involved, they'd have to get the administrative court to what's called state a case. It will be a very protracted process. They will be extremely unlikely to recover their costs. And unless there was going to be a class action, and this isn't the sort of situation because every case is different. My advice to them is, look, they accepted that they didn't have a reasonable excuse, move on with their lives and forget it. I would strongly urge people not to consider appealing because they will be throwing good money after bad.
What about if, from here on in, parents, and there were questions about this at the liaison committee earlier, if someone has COVID symptoms or they feel they might, and there's no local childcare and they want to travel, and they're stopped by the police, I wonder whether they could say, rather than saying, I'll accept your fixed penalty, whether they should say, well, no.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and I think they will be well advised to say, look, I've got grave concerns about my childcare arrangements, and this is why I'm travelling. And if it's good enough for Dominic Cummings, it's good enough for me. And I imagine that if people gave that excuse, of course, provided it was genuine, people can't lie, because if they lie, they're committing a criminal offence. But if they gave that excuse under genuine circumstances, the police would exercise their discretion, and I imagine they would not. They'd ask a few questions in relation to it, and it's within their discretion whether to pursue it or not. But I think now the police would probably not seek to pursue those cases. And at the end of the day, if the police wanted to pursue it, it's always open to the person who is basically being accused of leaving home without a reasonable excuse to say, look, I'm not going to pay a fixed penalty, we'll go to court. The problem with going to court, of course, is there are unlimited fines if you are convicted, but you are entitled to have a trial at the magistrate's court if that's what you want to do.
What's your view of the legality or otherwise of what Dominic Cummings did?
My view is that his trip to his parents was illegal. He travelled 260 miles. There were other arrangements that he could have put in place. There were family in London. He didn't pursue any inquiries, as far as we're aware, in relation to those. It's completely against the spirit of the legislation. I mean, if we just look at the Act, it's dealt with in Section 6. You cannot leave home without a reasonable excuse. There are 13 reasonable excuses. To be fair, the list is not exhaustive. His argument would be, in my view, stretching it incredibly for the court to find that in these circumstances it was a reasonable excuse. And obviously that's something the police would say, well, we're going to charge you, and you explain. The burden is on you to establish a reasonable excuse. It will be on him to establish that. There certainly will be more than a 50% chance of conviction, and it's certainly in the public interest to prosecute. We then have the birthday trip to the beauty resort at Barnard Castle.
Excuse me, if I can just correct you, that was to test his eyesight.
That I was going to say that was the 30-mile trip was to test his eyesight. Now, if you have any concerns about your eyesight, you first of all you have a legal obligation, a legal duty to notify DVLA. You have a legal duty to notify your insurance. If you don't do so, your insurance is probably vitiated. The last thing you do is get in a car with your wife and child to see whether or not your eyesight is all right for obvious reasons. I mean, it's the most bizarre excuse what one could put forward, particularly for someone of his standing. And then, of course, we understand that he gets out of his car and there's a suggestion that he took a short form of exercise. Well, we're told that at this stage, 2 days into lockdown, or very shortly, this was the first phase of lockdown, you're not allowed to drive for the purposes of exercising. You walk from home. So that there are numerous situations there where, in my view, he has broken the law. And obviously the matter is now going to be investigated fully by the police force, and we'll have to see what they come up with, if anything.
Do you think we might see a prosecution?
I think we should see a prosecution, but I can't say anything more than that. I think we should see a prosecution because, in my view, the law's been clearly broken.
Very good to hear from you. Thanks so much. That's Nick Freeman, lawyer, obviously sometimes known as Mr. Loophole, holding forth on what Dominic Cummings has been doing. That liaison committee is